topic I chose to talk about today is the effects of gun violence. I chose this topic because gun violence brings awareness to a major public health crisis throughout the United States, and it's also in relation to my major of criminalistics. When did gun violence become a problem? In the early 1960s is when gun violence started to become a major problem in the United States, and that's exactly when the crime rates began to spike and are continuing to do so. During the 1960s also involved the Cold War, the Vietnam War, and the Civil Rights Movement, which obviously addressed a lot of controversial topics and started a lot of violence in the United States. And who's affected? Throughout the United States, almost every community is affected by gun violence in some type of way, either directly or indirectly. That also includes children, adults, and communities that are poor or mixed with different races, cultures, or religions. Organizations involved in gun violence. The three major organizations I cover throughout my couple of weeks in DC is the Brady Campaign, Gun Owners of America, and the National Rifle Association. This isn't all of the organizations who support guns, but it's the top three major in the United States. And these organizations support guns because of self-defense rights, Second Amendment rights, for hunting and recreational uses. And the organizations that are against guns in the United States that I cover is social service agencies, families, businesses, faith communities, law enforcement personnel, and a group called Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. And all of these organizations are against guns because they want to reduce death rates. They fear that there's a lack of gun safety or training in the United States. There's an interruption of education, and they could have been affected from a death of a loved one or someone in their community. The issues that come with gun violence are the effects on child development or the interruption of education, mental health concerns, a shift in community culture, easy access to firearms, a violation of the Second Amendment rights, high death rates or crime rates, and a lack of gun laws/restrictions. Possible solutions to gun violence: banning assault weapons and high-capacity ammunition magazines, enabling the CDC to research gun violence as a public health issue, requiring background checks, supporting local prevention/intervention programs, disarming domestic abusers/criminals, and ensuring risk protection orders are available in all states. Most of these solutions are far from being able to be tested or put to action. Until society acknowledges gun violence as a public health crisis, there isn't much that can be done to end it. The best way to start getting involved and create noise is to bring awareness to the controversial issue, is to start off in your communities by gathering information on intervention programs and reaching out to communities who lack these organizations in order to provide everyone with information and knowledge on this issue. The most important part of this presentation is covering the experiential involvement on gun violence. I was required to do 3 hours of community involvement on my issue of gun violence, and I was able to go home during spring break and interview Detective Lieutenant Brooks and volunteer with their violence prevention program. What did I do for my 3 hours of involvement on gun violence? I was able to interview Detective Lieutenant Brooks on the effects gun violence had on his department and the Boston Police Department and his communities. I was also able to attend a Q&A hosted by the Boston Police Department at a local coffee shop and be able to view how they interact with the community and the public. And the last thing I was able to do was volunteer with the violence prevention program created by the Boston Police Department, where the officers collected supplies to help those who are affected by gun violence get back to a normal life or routine. They collected things such as clothes, support group information from organizations, food, health necessities, and gathered information from community officials on what each community specifically can do to prevent gun violence and how they can accomplish that. Within my 3 hours of involvement on gun violence, I was able to interview Detective Lieutenant Brooks, and some of the questions I asked him were, why did you choose to become an officer? Does gun violence affect your officers or the community more? How do you work with the community to prevent or lower gun violence? Is there a chance of the violence to stop in the next 5 years or no? And what's the most important thing you could tell a civilian about gun violence? Throughout these 5 questions I asked Detective Lieutenant Brooks, I got some honest answers that reflected his personal values and beliefs and also the department he runs. For the first question, Detective Lieutenant Brooks chose his occupation because it was more of a family calling or tradition to be in some sort of law enforcement career. But he also wanted to make a difference in his community and make a difference that mattered to him and society. For the second question, Detective Lieutenant Brooks mentioned that gun violence affects both his community and officers in a similar way. He worries about his officers' safety when they answer calls in high crime rate areas, and he worries about the community violence when an officer or another civilian may act on fear when put in a certain situation. For the third question, Detective Lieutenant Brooks mentions creating a violence intervention program within his police department to reduce gun violence in a city. He also emphasizes the importance of community policing and how it improved the relationship between officers and the community. It creates more of a trust or respect within the department and the public. For question number 4, throughout the interview, Detective Lieutenant Brooks states, "A very slight chance, but it is something that takes time and effort to stop. The concern of gun violence in Boston is something that won't go away overnight. But with enough knowledge and support, it may be possible to start reducing the violence and eventually end gun violence without silencing the people or their rights." To wrap up the interview questions, for number 5, what the most important thing you could tell a civilian about gun violence, Detective Lieutenant Brooks answered honestly. He said, "You're not alone. Whether you're affected by gun violence or the community you're in, it's important to remember there are people to help you and resources that are available to everyone in the community. When people think they're alone, they tend to react with violence, especially when it's all they know and it's all they've seen." To sum up this presentation, based on these possible solutions and resources that are already provided for gun violence, they can be now put to the test. When it comes to gun violence, it's hard to test out possible solutions when there are so many factors that contribute to this violent topic as a whole. If these organizations created strict laws on gun control and enforced background checks, it would narrow out the gun holders who shouldn't be entrusted with the weapons due to a criminal background or other red flags. After this major solution is put to these tests, organizations can then start by banning the sales of certain ammunition and style of military guns to ensure normal civilians don't have access to such a powerful weapon that can create more damage than a simple 9mm or a hunting rifle. The last major solution that can be tested to create the opening these organizations need to reduce gun violence is supporting local prevention or intervention programs to help those in the community have a general understanding on why their communities are affected by the violence and learn new ways to help reduce the gun violence and create a safe community for the younger generations. Although there aren't solid results to these solutions on gun violence, there is a sense of winning when organizations already know what needs to be done and how to execute it by starting with connecting to the community that is most affected.